The mansion was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to choke the air, until the sharp crack of a gunshot ripped through it, and silence was replaced with horror. Blood sprayed across the marble floor, painting the wealth of a dynasty in crimson. Vincent Rossi, the feared Mafia kingpin, staggered as the bullet tore into him, his eyes wide with disbelief. He clutched his chest, gasping, while shadows shifted in the dim light, watching his empire collapse in one violent heartbeat. A single phone clattered onto the floor as his trembling hand typed the final message. "It's done. The king is dead." Marco Rossi said, "Father, no, this can't be real." But Vincent's gaze was already fading, his once indomitable presence reduced to a whisper of mortality. The chandelier above flickered, casting fractured light on his bloodied hand. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, but inside these walls, there was only despair. The world had just shifted, power splintering into chaos, and betrayal was now the only certainty. The war had begun, though none of them knew how deep it would cut or who would survive the storm. The city skyline burned with neon light, but beneath its beauty, rot festered. Marco Rossi stood at the window of his penthouse, whiskey glass trembling in his hand. Marco said, "He built an empire, and now it crumbles in my hands." The weight of his father's death pressed against his chest like a chain of iron. Memories of his childhood flashed before him, family dinners drenched in fear, promises made in smoke-filled rooms, and the echo of his father's stern voice. He wanted to cry, but rage swallowed his grief. Somewhere in the streets below, rivals celebrated. They would come for him, like wolves drawn to blood. The city was alive with noise, but Marco only heard silence inside his head, the silence of a kingdom without a king. His father's enemies wouldn't wait. The war had already begun, and Marco knew he was no longer the son of a king. He was a marked man standing on the edge of ruin. The cold hum of a fluorescent light filled the interrogation room. Across from Marco sat Detective Sarah Blake, her sharp eyes cutting through the silence. Sarah said, "We know you're next in line. You want to survive, you work with us." Marco clenched his jaw, anger coiling beneath his calm facade. He hated the cops, but survival demanded compromise. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of family loyalty pressing against the crushing demand for justice. Marco said, "You're asking me to betray my blood." Sarah leaned forward, her voice a whisper that stabbed like a knife. Sarah said, "Your blood betrayed you first." The words shattered something inside him. The world outside this room was fire, but here, truth and lies burned just as hot. Deep in the heart of the city, another figure moved into play. Lucian Moretti, the ruthless kingpin who inherited Rossi's empire, stood before his men. Lucian said, "The throne is mine, and no one will take it from me." His voice dripped with authority, every word like a blade. His men bowed, shadows cast long against warehouse walls. He knew Marco would resist, but resistance was weakness, and weakness was death. Lucian's eyes gleamed with hunger for power, the kind that consumed everything it touched. A storm brewed within his heart, and in its eye he saw only victory. Night thickened with whispers of betrayal. In a smoky backroom, under dim amber light, men murmured of secrets and hidden knives. A trusted lieutenant leaned closer to Marco, eyes narrowed. He said, "Someone close set this in motion. Your father's fall wasn't chance." Marco's stomach knotted, fury flaring like fire. His father had enemies, but the thought of betrayal from within carved deeper than any blade. The air reeked of smoke and distrust. Marco said, "If blood betrayed blood, then none of us are safe." His voice cracked under the weight of truth. In that moment, paranoia bloomed like poison, spreading fast. The war wasn't just out there in the streets, it was already inside their walls. The old Rossi club throbbed with music, but beneath the lights, fear lingered. Marco Rossi walked through the crowd, his sharp gaze slicing through the haze of smoke and neon. Marco said, "They're waiting for me to fall, but I'll make them kneel." His voice trembled with rage, but his steps carried the weight of determination. The tables were filled with men who once toasted his father, yet now they whispered in shadows, doubting his strength. He clenched his jaw as their eyes followed, measuring him, daring him. He sat at the head table, shoulders squared, but the throne felt hollow. His father's ghost hung heavy, watching. The glasses clinked around him, but every sound was betrayal waiting to bloom. The club was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, one filled with jackals waiting for a mistake. Marco lit a cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark, a silent reminder that he was still breathing, still burning, even if the flames threatened to consume him. In the warehouse district, shadows stretched across rusted steel and broken glass. Dominic Varga, the enforcer, stood tall, his presence enough to silence whispers. Dominic, male 45, towered in black leather coat, scars cutting across his jaw, his stare cold as winter. Dominic said no loyalty, no mercy. A trembling man knelt before him, begging, sweat dripping under the harsh bulb light. Dominic raised the gun slowly, his movements calm, ritualistic. To him, this wasn't violence, it was order. Marco's orders demanded loyalty, and Dominic's job was to enforce it. The gunshot cracked like thunder, echoing through the cavernous steel walls, a reminder that betrayal had no safe corner. Men around him shifted uneasily, reminded of the price of weakness. Dominic wiped the gun, expression unchanged, but deep in his eyes flickered something rare, a shadow of regret. The deal was supposed to be quick, but trust was poison. Marco stood at the edge of the dockyard, ocean wind whipping his jacket as crates of weapons shifted under moonlight. His ally, Adrian Cole, once a rival, now extended his hand. Adrian said, "We want the same thing, survival." Marco's eyes narrowed, suspicion burning like fire. He hated trusting anyone, but tonight survival demanded new alliances. Gunmen lingered in shadows, watching tense fingers brushing triggers. Marco said, "If you betray me, I'll bury you myself." Adrian smirked, but his hand stayed outstretched, calm, determined. Waves crashed against steel as silence stretched. Marco's hand finally met Adrian's, firm, reluctant, sealing a bond born of necessity, not trust. The air felt heavier, as if the sea itself knew that deals made in darkness always demanded blood. Far from the guns and shadows, Marco Rossi sat in her apartment, the victim caught in a web she never chose. Elena, Marco's younger sister, traced her fingers over an old family photo. Elena said, "We were children, Marco. What did this world make of us?" Her voice trembled as the city's noise spilled through thin windows, sirens wailing like mourning cries. She wanted to believe in her brother, but the blood he carried seeped into her life too. A knock on the door froze her heart. Fear tightened her grip on the photo frame, her breath sharp. The Mafia's reach was everywhere, and innocence was fragile as glass. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for herself but for the brother who fought ghosts too heavy for one man. She whispered into the empty room, "Don't lose yourself, Marco, don't lose us." The night deepened, and with it, paranoia. Marco sat at his desk, a map of the city sprawled before him, pins marking enemy turf. His cigarette smoldered as shadows danced across the walls. Marco said, "Every street bleeds, and they all want my crown." The weight of legacy pressed hard, but he could no longer see loyalty, only daggers. His men stood in silence, eyes lowered, unsure who to trust. The empire his father built was unraveling, thread by thread. He leaned forward, exhaustion carving lines into his face. Marco said, "If betrayal is in my blood, then I'll cut it out myself." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp as steel. Outside, the city pulsed with violence, its heartbeat a drum of war. Inside, Marco prepared for the storm, knowing the greatest enemy might not come from the streets, but from the faces closest to him. Gunfire cracked like thunder in the narrow alleys of Little Naples, bodies diving for cover as chaos erupted. Marco Rossi sprinted through smoke and flashing muzzle fire, his heart pounding in rhythm with every bullet. Marco said, "Ambush, fall back now." His men scrambled behind overturned cars, trading fire with masked attackers pouring from rooftops. The night reeked of gasoline and blood, the symphony of war tearing apart the silence of the streets. Marco's fury burned as he realized this wasn't random. Someone had fed their location. Betrayal whispered in the ricochet of every shot. He reloaded, teeth clenched, eyes sharp with survival's fire. Marco said, "They want war. They'll choke on it." His voice echoed with both rage and desperation. A soldier forced a command in Hell's Theater. The alley became a graveyard, lit by gunfire flashes, and the weight of inevitability pressed down. Trust was dead, and only the ruthless would walk away. The night quieted only for deception to stir. Inside a candlelit backroom, Adrian Cole leaned close to Marco, words smooth as velvet. Adrian said, "Trust me, I'll bleed for you." Marco's jaw tightened, suspicion twisting his gut. His instincts screamed danger, but desperation dulled his edge. Adrian poured wine, his smirk hidden behind false warmth. The flicker of the flame painted shadows across his face, two-sided and unreadable. Marco said, "If you cross me, you won't live to regret it." The tension between them buzzed like a wire ready to snap. Adrian chuckled softly, his calm tone masking the weight of secrets. Adrian said, "I don't break deals, I bury enemies." The words cut both ways, half oath, half threat. Marco's mind spiraled, each word tightening the knot of paranoia. In this room, there were no friends, only devils dressed as allies, smiling as they set the trap. In the police safe house, Detective Sarah Blake threw a folder onto the table, photos spilling across the steel surface. Cartel leaders, politicians, mafia bosses. Sarah said, "This war isn't local, it's global." Marco leaned forward, his chest tight, staring at the truth his bloodline hid from him. Every image was a dagger of corruption. Sarah's voice sharpened. Sarah said, "They'll bury you alive unless you give me names." Marco's knuckles whitened, rage boiling under his skin. Marco said, "You want me to sell my soul to the law?" Sarah's eyes burned with unflinching steel. Sarah said, "No, you already sold it to blood." The words landed like a strike. Marco knew she was right. The Empire wasn't a family. It was a machine grinding everyone to ash. His silence was no longer survival. It was complicity in Hell's design. The mansion's underground room reeked of iron and old blood. Marco walked past chained men, bruised and broken, his stomach knotting at the Empire's rot. Marco said, "This is what loyalty looks like." His voice cracked between disgust and rage. Guards smirked, indifferent to the screams of prisoners. Marco's memories tore through him, nights of childhood dinners with laughter hiding the cost of power. The walls oozed secrets, every stain a reminder of cruelty passed as discipline. Marco gritted his teeth, bile rising as he stared at the horror his father called order. His fists trembled, his chest heaved, the weight of his family's sins choking him. Marco said, "No kingdom stands on bones without crumbling." His words were a curse, but also a vow. The Empire was a cancer, and it had already hollowed him. The night stretched thin as Marco drove through the city, paranoia gnawing at his bones. Every shadow felt like a blade, every silence a warning. His phone buzzed, silence on the other end, only breathing. Marco slammed the wheel, fury mixing with fear. Marco said, "They're watching me." His eyes darted to the mirrors, headlights trailing behind too long. Sweat lined his brow as he pushed the accelerator, heart hammering louder than the engine. Betrayal was no longer whispers, it was breathing down his neck. The streets blurred, neon streaking across his windshield, but his mind burned with the realization. Someone inside was feeding the wolves. The war wasn't only on the streets, it was carved into his blood, clawing at his sanity. The car sped into darkness, carrying a man hunted not just by enemies, but by his own trust. The rain poured in sheets over the empty docks, the city's skyline shrouded in mist. Marco Rossi stood with Adrian Cole, both cloaked in shadows, as whispers of a hidden power reached them. Adrian said, The syndicate doesn't end with Moretti, it begins with someone darker. Marco's pulse spiked, eyes narrowing as the storm mirrored the turmoil inside him. Lightning flashed, illuminating a briefcase filled with documents that exposed a third hand in the Empire. Marco said, "Then who the hell is pulling the strings?" His voice cracked, equal parts fury and fear. The storm roared, carrying away words meant only for those who dared listen. Their alliance was fragile, their steps careful, but the truth was now a blade pressed to both their throats. The Empire wasn't what they thought. It was bigger, hungrier, and built on lies older than blood. The warehouse reeked of sweat and gasoline. Dominic Varga, the enforcer, leaned against steel beams, his scarred face hardened but his eyes unsettled. Dominic said, "We keep killing, but for what? Ghosts we never see?" Around him, bodies slumped, men silenced by his brutality. For years, violence was his only scripture, but tonight the scripture cracked. A flash of conscience hit like a bullet. He remembered faces, men, women, even children, silenced by his hand. His fingers twitched on the trigger, trembling with something unfamiliar. Doubt. Marco's orders were clear, but Dominic's soul had grown weary of blood. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe I've been dead longer than they ever were." The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than gunfire, heavier than the Empire itself. Elena Rossi's world collapsed in a single scream. She had been followed, cornered, dragged into a darkened apartment where her wrists now shook against ropes. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "Marco, save me." The victim of power she never asked for, Elena's innocence was now currency in a brutal war. Her captors whispered in foreign tongues, knives glinting in weak light. Fear throbbed through her chest, her pulse louder than the rain pounding on cracked windows. She thought of her brother, drowning in a war that would consume them both. Her words trembled as she cried into the silence, "Don't let them turn me into another ghost." Her voice cracked, soft but defiant, her pain becoming the spark that would either break Marco or drive him deeper into fire. In a smoky back room, Adrian Cole sat across from rival lieutenants, his smirk sharp as a blade. Adrian said, "Moretti is weak, Rossi is blind. Why not let me lead?" His words slithered like poison, twisting loyalties. He poured drinks, laughter covering daggers, while hidden motives burned in his eyes. Marco trusted him, but Adrian was weaving chaos, aligning wolves behind his back. Every word was a lie, dressed as loyalty, every toast a nail in the coffin of trust. The men listened, hesitant but tempted, the allure of power heavier than their vows. Adrian's game was nearing its climax, his smile a mask hiding the knife. He'd already plunged into the heart of the syndicate. He whispered, "The Empire doesn't need a king. It needs a survivor." The mansion's dining hall erupted in shouting, voices colliding like broken glass. Marco slammed his fist onto the table, wine spilling across maps of the city. Marco said, "There's a snake among us, and I'll cut its head off." His men shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting, whispers turning to accusations. Paranoia clawed at the room, tearing threads of loyalty apart. Every face was suspect, every silence guilt. The chandelier above flickered, its fractured light painting chaos across their grim faces. Betrayal wasn't creeping anymore. It was roaring through the walls. Marco's voice rose, heavy with desperation. Marco said, "If trust dies tonight, the family dies with it." His words landed like stones, but the silence that followed was heavier. The Empire was splitting from within, and no blade could stitch it whole again. The Rossi mansion's library, once filled with echoes of strategy and power, now trembled under the weight of revelation. Marco Rossi stood frozen, staring at a hidden file laid open across the desk. Birth certificates, bank transfers, coded letters. His hands shook as he read the signature. It was Elena Rossi. Marco whispered, "My sister, you betrayed me." His voice cracked, torn between disbelief and anguish. The room spun, every memory of shared laughter now poisoned with deceit. Elena stepped into the light, tears streaking her face. Elena said, "I had no choice. I did this for survival, not destruction." Her words carved into Marco like blades, every syllable unraveling his faith in blood. The walls seemed to close in, the chandeliers casting fractured shadows that mirrored his shattered trust. The truth was not an enemy on the streets. It was his own bloodline, rotten from within. The storm outside roared as Adrian Cole revealed his true face. In a candlelit warehouse, he dropped the mask of loyalty, smirking with venom. Adrian said, "I was never your ally. I was the hand pulling the strings." Marco's chest heaved, rage burning his veins. Adrian stepped forward, raising a pistol casually, the betrayal gleaming in his eyes. Adrian said, "You fought for crumbs, while I carved the empire beneath your feet." Marco snarled, his voice shaking. Marco said, "You'll drown in the blood you spilled." The air between them thickened, smoke curling like serpents as their partnership dissolved into pure enmity. The betrayal was complete. Adrian was not just a rival, he was the architect of chaos. And in his smile was the promise of a war more brutal than any Marco had imagined. Lucian Moretti, the kingpin, sat at the head of a long dining table, his empire crumbling around him. His lieutenants whispered nervously, papers spread showing losses, raids, betrayals. Lucian slammed his cane against the floor, silencing the room. Lucian said, "You think this empire breaks? No, it bends the world." But cracks ran deep in his eyes, his confidence bleeding into desperation. Behind him, masked allies hesitated, loyalty fraying thread by thread. The global shadow he once commanded now slipped through his fingers like sand. He stared at a map riddled with red marks, territories lost, allies dead, enemies rising. His empire was not immortal. It was mortal, fragile, and now bleeding from every wound. Lucian whispered, almost to himself, "If I fall, I'll drag the world down with me." The rain lashed against shattered windows as Marco stormed into a candlelit chamber where Elena waited. Her eyes were red from tears, but her voice held steel. Elena said, "I did what you couldn't. I tore it down from the inside." Marco's fists clenched, fury trembling through him. Marco said, "You destroyed everything we were." His words thundered, louder than the storm outside. Elena's face twisted, torn between guilt and defiance. She stepped closer, whispering, "I saved us from drowning in father's sins." The air pulsed with unspoken pain, every word dragging their shared past into the fire. Marco raised his pistol, hands shaking, torn between vengeance and love. Blood or mercy, he could choose only one. The Rossi mansion erupted in chaos. Gunfire rattled the walls as Marco's men turned on one another, suspicion boiling into violence. Marco stood at the center, his voice drowned in the roar of betrayal. Marco shouted, "Stop! You're tearing it apart!" But no one listened. Blood splattered across portraits of ancestors, the legacy collapsing in crimson ruin. The chandelier crashed, glass shattering like the family itself. Outside, thunder split the night, as if the heavens condemned the bloodletting below. Marco's chest heaved, his soul shattering with every scream. The empire wasn't dying by enemy fire, it was bleeding out from within. And Marco, drenched in betrayal, realized there was no saving what was already lost. Only survival remained, and survival meant burning the empire to ashes. The city exploded into chaos as Marco Rossi tore through rain-slick streets, headlights slicing the storm. His men fired from speeding cars, bullets sparking off wet asphalt. Marco gripped the wheel, jaw clenched, adrenaline drowning his grief. Marco shouted, "Don't stop until they're dust." Rival cars swerved behind, muzzle flashes strobing the night. Tires screeched, glass shattered. The world reduced to smoke, fire and vengeance. The chase wasn't about territory anymore. It was survival carved in blood. Every corner was a battlefield, every shadow a gun barrel. Marco's heart thundered louder than the engine, his veins burning with fury. Betrayal had stolen his soul, but this night demanded his war. He whispered through gritted teeth, "If this is hell, I'll drag them through it with me." Inside a crumbling hideout, Adrian Cole leaned against a cracked wall, smirking as gunfire rumbled outside. Adrian said, "He thinks loyalty wins wars. It only buries fools." Marco's ally, Adrian's rival in shadow, burst in, face streaked with blood. The man snarled, "If you're in this, you're with me." Adrian's grin widened, twisting truth into a weapon. Adrian said, "No, I'm with survival." Their uneasy truce solidified in silence, forged by necessity, not trust. Marco arrived, drenched and furious, slamming his fist into the table. Marco said, "If you stay, you bleed for me. If you run, I bury you myself." His words seared into the room, heavier than gunfire. The choice was no longer trust or betrayal. It was survival under his shadow or death in the storm. Dominic Varga stood in the ruins of an alley, rain dripping from his bald head, his pistol heavy in his hand. Bodies lay sprawled around him, lifeless eyes reflecting the storm. For years he was executioner, the silent blade of empire, but now guilt bled into his steel. Dominic whispered, "How many ghosts walk with me?" His voice cracked, haunted by every face silenced. A young man groaned, blood pooling beneath him. Dominic raised his gun, but his hand trembled. For the first time, the enforcer faltered. He dropped the weapon, chest heaving with shame. Marco appeared, eyes hard. Marco said, "We're all damned, Dominic. The only choice is how we burn." The words struck deep, but Dominic's silence was heavier. Tonight his war was not against enemies. It was against himself. In a high-rise penthouse, Detective Sarah Blake spread documents across glass tables, her eyes sharp with fury. Sarah said, "This isn't a mafia war. It's a conspiracy of governments and cartels." Marco's chest tightened as he stared at photos of political elites, shaking hands with syndicate bosses. His family wasn't just part of crime. They were pawns in a global empire. Marco whispered, "We were never kings. We were their soldiers." Sarah's glare cut through his despair. Sarah said, "Expose them, and you'll bring the world crashing down." The truth was a weight heavier than any bullet. Marco clenched his fists, torn between vengeance and revelation. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. Justice was no longer about family. It was about the world's shadow. The night reached its breaking point. Marco stood on a rooftop overlooking the city, rain pounding like war drums. His chest heaved, pistol in one hand, memories of betrayal in the other. Behind him, Adrian Cole approached, his smirk gone, replaced with grim resolve. Adrian said, "Tomorrow, there is no empire, only ashes." Marco didn't turn, his eyes fixed on the burning streets below. Marco whispered, "If it ends with me." The wind howled, lightning splitting the sky, framing them as silhouettes of ruin. They were no longer men. They were scars of an empire collapsing in blood. The storms swallowed their silence, and with it came the promise of the final war. Redemption or damnation. There would be no in-between. The storm subsided as Marco Rossi arrived at Lucian Moretti's estate, a fortress of marble and steel cloaked in silence. Armed guards lined the path, their eyes cold, but the weight of the night pressed heavier than their guns. Marco walked forward, pistol hidden beneath his coat, every step echoing the ghosts that followed. He whispered, "This ends tonight." The estate's golden lights burned through the mist, a mockery of peace hiding carnage beneath. Inside, chandeliers flickered, tables draped in velvet, shadows stretching like predators across walls. The air smelled of smoke and old blood. Every heartbeat reminded Marco he wasn't walking into a house, he was walking into judgment. His enemy waited at the throne, and between them stood the last threads of survival. Inside the grand hall, Lucian Moretti stood tall, cane in hand, his gaze cutting like steel. Marco's footsteps echoed as he approached, their eyes locking in silence. Lucian smirked, his voice calm but venomous. Lucian said, "You carry your father's weakness. You'll die with it." Marco's jaw clenched, rage boiling beneath his calm mask. Marco said, "No, I carry his sins, and tonight I bury them." The chandeliers flickered, glass trembling as thunder rolled. Two men, both broken by legacy, stood in the heart of a crumbling empire. Moretti's lips curled into a cold smile. Lucian said, "Then let's finish this like kings." Their words were blades, cutting deeper than bullets, and the air between them pulsed with the weight of finality. The walls shook as gunfire erupted. Marco dove behind an overturned table, bullets tearing through velvet. Moretti fired with precision, his cane doubling as a hidden weapon. Marco rolled, returning fire, muzzle flashes strobing the hall into chaos. Statues crumbled, portraits shredded, the empire itself collapsing with every shot. Marco's breath came ragged, sweat and blood mixing as he crawled forward. Moretti's laughter echoed through smoke. Lucian said, "You can't kill what never dies." Marco snarled, rising with fury burning in his veins. Marco said, "Then I'll bury your shadow." Their duel was no longer about bullets. It was about legacy. One man trying to end it, the other trying to immortalize it. The hall became their battlefield, their graves waiting in its silence. The smoke thinned, silence returning like a knife. Marco pinned Moretti against a shattered pillar, pistol pressed to his chest. But hesitation burned in his eyes. Marco said, "Killing you makes me you." His voice cracked, torn by rage and despair. Moretti sneered, blood at his lips. Lucian said, "Then embrace it, you were never anything else." Marco's hand trembled, memories of Elena, Dominic, Sarah flashing in his mind. He could end the empire with one pull, but at the cost of his soul. Instead, he turned the gun aside, fired into the ceiling, and stepped back. Marco said, "The world will know your sins. That's your execution." Moretti's scream echoed, fury ripping through the ruins. The choice was made, revenge denied, justice born in exposure. Dawn broke over the city, rain-washed streets glowing under pale light. Marco staggered from the burning estate, his body bruised, his soul hollow. Smoke curled behind him, the empire reduced to ashes. He walked into silence, no crown, no victory, only survival. Marco whispered, "This isn't redemption. It's ruin." His words carried into the wind, swallowed by the city's heartbeat. Far in the distance, a phone rang, its shrill echo haunting him like a curse. The world was free of one empire, but chains still wrapped the streets. Marco's figure faded into the fog, a man scarred beyond repair, yet still walking. The war was over, but the cost of survival was everything.